Some of you watching this will think of yourselves as actors, but many won't. But I'm going to tell you that even if you're not one of those people who delights in the sound of your own voice, it's very important that you still have a go at step 5 in my series and read Shakespeare aloud so you can feel it in your mouth and hear your own voice reverberating as you speak the words. Welcome to All Strut, No Fret. I'm Dr Anna Kamaralli, and this is the concluding video on Twelfth Night. Because our focus throughout this whole episode is on step 5, you should take it as an invitation as we go through the video every time I show you a passage from the play to experiment with reading it aloud and see what it really feels like to get inside the words. Since the very beginning of this series, I've been advising you to keep looking as you go through the plays for whether the text is written in verse form or when it's written in prose. And Twelfth Night is a terrific chance to see the effects of that, to see why it should make a difference, because two of our key characters, Viola and Olivia, are constantly switching between the two. Remember that you can tell it's verse if each line begins with a capital letter, and this will also make the ends of the lines down the right-hand side of the page look more uneven. If it's prose, it will just look like an ordinary book. When Viola and Olivia meet for the first time in Act 1, Scene 5, they begin the scene in prose, but by the end they're speaking to each other in verse. So this is a perfect chance to see what effects it has, and I say effects deliberately because it's never just one thing. So think about all the different ways it affects what you're hearing and how you're understanding the dynamic between people when they're speaking in prose to each other or speaking in verse to each other, or whether there's some conflict or dynamic of change between the two. In this little snippet I've pulled out of the scene, Viola is speaking in verse at this point, but Olivia is sticking determinedly with prose until there's a point where she switches to verse to match Viola. Can you spot where it is, and can you think why it would be that it's that particular moment that she chooses to change? If you read that scene aloud, can you feel the difference in how it feels to speak the verse from speaking the prose? Now let's look at what can happen when two characters are speaking verse to each other in a back and forth dialogue. One really charming thing and very instructive thing we see in this scene between Orsino and Viola is the way a split line between two characters who are building on an increasing intimacy will show them becoming in sympathy with each other's thoughts. The way we these days talk about people finishing each other's sentences. The split lines in this particular scene are really exceptional because you're going to find several points where they don't just answer each other in an even pentameter, but actually overlap. So the answering person has to jump in on the speaking person's last syllable. And that I owe Olivia, but I know. I has to overlap with the end of Olivia for the scansion to work in that line. I should, your lordship, and what's her history? Again, and has to overlap with ship in order for that split line to make an even pentameter. So these two are now so in sync, they're actually speaking over the top of each other to finish a line. When you're in the process of marking up scansion, all you're doing is looking for a pattern. The idea is to find a pattern, but then to go on and see where there are changes. When the changes happen to the pattern, those are the things that we should be alert to because they might be telling us something exciting. So what you're doing the whole time is you're looking for the pattern, you're trying to establish the pattern, but then you have to look for the change and you have to ask what the change does. I think one of the most special places to find how that works in the whole of Shakespeare is here in Twelfth Night, and it happens in the scene we've looked at earlier where Orsino and Viola are beginning to share each other's iambic pentameters, where we're seeing those split lines that make them look in sync, but at the same time we're seeing a very strong and regular pattern of complete iambic pentameters until this one point. Viola comes very close to confessing the truth to Orsino, but she does it by telling an outrageous lie. She makes up a whole story of a fictitious sister she has who loved a man entirely but never spoke her love. She pined in thought, smiling at grief. Was that not love indeed? Now, Orsino does something very out of character. He actually asks a question that is not self-centered or selfish, but is entirely about the well-being, inquiring after the well-being of another person. He says, "But died thy sister of her love, my boy?" So again, complete, neat, firm iambic pentameter there. And in response, Viola replies, "I am all the daughters of my father's house." It's the only trochaic line in the scene. And it's the only time that she's telling the truth. So this is where you read aloud. This is where you try it out and see what happens. Try saying line after line after line in an iambic meter and then suddenly switching to a trochaic line. Tell me what happens. Our shows are more than will, for still we prove much in our vows, but little in our love. But died thy sister of her love, my boy? I am all the daughters of my father's house. And all the brothers too. Next line, she's back to speaking in iams, and she's back to lying. But in that moment of truth, she switches, reverses the meter of her line, and the actress doing that is almost certain to hesitate, stumble, or choke in needing to make that switch. And that's what the meter can do for the emotional moment of a scene. There are other ways to control the flow of a spoken line besides the basic pattern of the meter. For example, monosyllables take longer to say than polysyllables. Try these two examples, both 4 syllables long. The way the ends of the verse lines do or don't match the ends of the phrases, thoughts, or sentences also have an effect. There are 4 lines here. 3 of them are end-stopped, at least a little, and 1 of them is enjambed. Find yourself an end-stopped passage of verse and an enjambed passage and read the two and see how that affects your speed of reading. Do you speed up or slow down? Where do you pause? Where do you feel impelled to run on? Here's a fairly simple little end-stopped passage of Viola's. Use it for practice. Mark up the scansion, read it aloud, and see how steady those punctuation marks make you feel. I've already marked up the scansion for you here on this enjambed passage. Now, this is the bit I really want you to try reading out loud because of its quirkiness. What you're going to find as you read this passage is that the lines are enjambed, that is, the sentences or thoughts run on past the end of the verse line and finish somewhere in the middle of the next line. But at the same time, each one of these lines has its final word make up part of a rhyming couplet. So your job is to make sense of the sentences with your voice while at the same time getting across the fact that this is actually a joyous poem of recognition where Viola has found out that her brother Sebastian is not dead after all. Good luck with that. Now we've reached the conclusion of Twelfth Night and also of our 5 steps. We're going to go on in the next videos to focus more on the influences of those things we've learned on understanding characters. Because all this would mean nothing if it didn't bring us to a place where we can hear things in the plays that we get some value out of being told. And I think this play asks us to look closely at our own reflection and ask it, well, how do we know who it is that we really love? All the passages that we've dealt with in detail during the 12th Night videos are perfect for you to practice reading aloud. The reading aloud helps you figure out the scansion, and the scansion helps you figure out how it should be spoken. And it's only by doing those things together and by hearing your own voice inhabiting the lines that you can come to experience the same feelings as this imaginary character who we suppose is gradually, painfully learning about themselves and how they can understand what and whom it is they love.